December 30th, 1988, Stone Mountain, Georgia. A 20-year-old woman is at the front door of her apartment, doing the most ordinary thing in the world, turning the lock, making sure the day is sealed behind her, preparing to meet her boyfriend, thinking about whatever a young person thinks about on a winter night when life still feels open and predictable. Then she hears a noise close, wrong, inside the space that is supposed to be safe. She turns, and the room changes shape in an instant. A man in a ski mask is there, close enough that she cannot run, close enough that the air between them disappears. A knife presses to her throat, not as a warning, but as a command. He forces her away from the door, away from light and neighbors and normal life, pushing her toward the wooded area behind the apartment complex on Weatherly Drive. Every step is a calculation. Do what he says. Stay alive. Do not make the wrong sound. Do not fall. In the trees, in the dark, he threatens to kill her if she resists, and he sexually assaults her at knife point. When he is finished, he orders her to stay on the ground and not move, then he runs, vanishing back into the night as quickly as he appeared, leaving her alone with the cold, the leaves, and the shock that makes time feel unreal. Subscribe to the channel if you want more true documentary stories told step by step, with the full timeline, the investigation details, and what happened in court, because the cases that take decades to solve are the ones that reveal how truth can be buried and how it can still come back. She does what survivors often do in those first minutes after a violent crime. She tries to survive the moment that comes after. She waits long enough to be sure he is not circling back, not standing somewhere in the tree line watching, not waiting for her to make the mistake of moving too early. Then she runs, not gracefully, not heroically, just running the way a person runs when fear is bigger than exhaustion. When every shadow looks like the attacker's return, she reaches a nearby neighborhood and finds help. One woman, a stranger, becomes a lifeline, a phone, a calm voice, hands that do not push her away. The victim calls her boyfriend, and he comes. And he does what people do when they do not know what else to do. He drives her to the police, because the only language that feels official enough for horror is a report, a statement, a record that says, "This happened to me tonight." At the DeKalb County Police Department, she tells investigators what she can, describing the mask, the knife, the forced walk into the woods, the threats, the assault, the order to stay down. The details matter, even when they hurt to say out loud, because details are the thin thread that might someday lead back to a name. Police move fast, because early hours are often the only hours you get before a trail goes cold. Officers search the wooded area behind the apartment complex, sweeping through darkness and brush, looking for anything that does not belong there, anything dropped in panic or tossed aside. They find the victim's purse and other personal items scattered in the woods, things that were hers a few hours earlier and now feel like evidence from another life. She is taken to Grady Memorial Hospital, where a sexual assault examination is performed, clinical steps carried out under harsh lights, a process that is necessary and invasive at the same time. The kit is collected, biological evidence that, in a perfect world, would point directly to the attacker. But this is 1988. The world of forensic DNA is not yet what it will become. There is no quick database search, no instant match, no clean moment where a lab report hands investigators a suspect. Instead, there is the slower reality of that era, statements, canvassing, leads that depend on chance, and evidence that can only sit and wait for the science that has not arrived.
And so the case becomes what so many sexual assault cases became in that period: a file with an open wound inside it. The victim's life continues, because it has to, but it is altered. The place where she lived, the walk to her door, the sound of a lock clicking into place, those ordinary things are no longer neutral. The investigators have what they have: the crime scene location, her report, the recovered belongings, the medical kit. They can compare patterns, check local offenders, ask questions, look for similar attacks. But without a definitive forensic link, the case can drift into the long, frustrating middle ground where suspicion exists but certainty does not. Years go by. The victim grows older. People move. Addresses change. Memories blur. The attacker, if he stays free, has the ultimate advantage: time. Time makes witnesses disappear. Time makes details fade. Time makes a single night in 1988 feel like ancient history to everyone except the person who lived it. Yet one choice made in those first hours will matter more than anyone can fully understand at the time. The biological evidence from the hospital examination is preserved. It is not thrown away. It is not lost in a careless purge. It is stored, kept in a place where, someday, it can be tested with tools that do not yet exist. That act of preservation is not dramatic, but it is everything. It is the difference between a crime that stays a story and a crime that can later become a case again. The evidence is maintained at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, waiting through decades of technological change, through shifting budgets and priorities, through the cultural silence that for years surrounded sexual violence. It waits while the country changes. It waits while DNA becomes the gold standard, while databases are built, while the idea of matching an unknown attacker to a known profile goes from impossible to routine. In 2015, a new push begins in the United States to confront a problem that had been hiding in plain sight. Thousands of sexual assault kits collected but never tested, sitting in storage, each one representing a person who reported a crime and then watched the system stall. Federal funding is directed toward testing previously unsubmitted kits, creating a path for old evidence to be examined with modern tools. In Georgia, agencies partner and form working groups to move cases forward, including the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office working alongside statewide criminal justice coordination efforts. The goal is not just administrative. It is moral. It is the idea that time should not erase accountability, and that the decision to report a crime should not end in a box on a shelf. For the 1988 Weatherly Drive attack, that funding and that renewed attention becomes the turning point. The preserved kit is tested. The lab work does what it was always meant to do. It pulls a genetic profile from the evidence, a signature that does not care about excuses or decades or fading memories. Then the next step is the one that transforms a profile into a name. The profile is compared against a national DNA database system used by law enforcement. In June 2019, there is a match. A hit. A connection between the unknown attacker in the woods and a specific individual. Reginald Colwell. At that moment, the case that began with a masked man and a knife stops being an unsolved horror and becomes an active prosecution again. A match is not the end, because the system still has to do the slow, careful work of turning a database result into courtroom proof. Investigators obtain a warrant to collect a DNA sample from Colwell. This is the confirmation step, the safeguard that says, we are not relying solely on a database entry, we are verifying. The sample is taken, tested, and it confirms what the 2019 match suggested. Colwell's DNA is present in the sexual assault kit evidence collected from the victim. Alongside that forensic confirmation, investigators also establish a crucial contextual fact. In 1988, Colwell lived in DeKalb County. He was not a ghost from another state, not someone who could be explained away as a statistical fluke. He was local at the time of the crime, within the geographic reality of how such an attack could happen. Now the case becomes a collision of two eras. On one side is 1988. The victim's report, the fear, the woods behind an apartment complex, the scattered purse, the hospital examination, the investigative limitations of the time. On the other side is the modern courtroom. DNA experts, chain of custody documentation, database procedures, and the hard question of what justice means when it arrives decades late. This is where many people misunderstand cold cases. They imagine the years as emptiness, as if nothing happened between the crime and the arrest. But the years are not empty for the survivor. They are years of living with what happened, years of wondering if the attacker did it again, years of carrying the knowledge that someone capable of that violence might be walking free. When a case resurfaces after 30 years, it does not reopen an old wound, it proves the wound never fully closed. Charges are brought, and the language of the law tries to contain what happened in the woods. Kidnapping, rape, aggravated assault. Kidnapping because he forced her from the safety of her apartment area into the wooded area, using a knife and threats. Rape because the sexual assault was forced. Aggravated assault because the weapon and the threats were not incidental. They were central to control, to terror, to the victim's inability to escape. These are not abstract terms. They are legal labels for moments of fear, for the knife at the throat, for the coercion that stripped away choice. The case goes to trial in DeKalb County Superior Court, with Judge Gregory Adams presiding. By the time the case is heard, the crime is almost 40 years old. But evidence does not have an age the way a person does. DNA does not soften. It does not forget. It does not reinterpret itself over time. It sits inside the record like a fingerprint left in the past, waiting for the future to learn how to read it. In court, The prosecution has to do more than present a match. They have to show reliability. How the kit was collected, how it was stored, how it was tested, how the profile was developed, how the database match occurred, and how the confirmatory sample from Colwell sealed the identification. They have to show that the evidence was handled properly across decades, that procedures were followed, that the science is sound. They also have to bring the human story back into a room that is built for rules and objections. The victim's account matters, not just as emotion, but as narrative that explains why the evidence exists at all, why the kit was collected, why the assault is not a theoretical lab exercise but a crime committed against a person. The defense, as defenses often do in cases like this, can try to lean on time. Suggest doubt, suggest contamination, suggest that decades create uncertainty, suggest that memories cannot be trusted. But the core problem for the defense is that this is not only memory. It is biology. It is the attacker's genetic material preserved from the night of the crime. Jurors, sitting with the weight of what they are hearing, have to do the uncomfortable work of translating testimony and lab reports into a verdict. They have to decide whether the state has proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, even though the crime happened long ago. Cold case juries are asked to be time travelers. They must imagine a night before smartphones and cameras on every corner, a night when a person could commit a violent assault in the woods and disappear into the darkness with little fear of being identified. They must also understand the modern forensic world that can reach back and pull a name from evidence that once seemed mute. If they believe the evidence, they are not judging a man's past abstractly. They are deciding whether he is accountable now for what he did then. The jury finds Reginald Colwell guilty. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of rape. Guilty of aggravated assault. And then comes sentencing, the moment where the court has to decide what the future looks like for a crime rooted in the past. On a Tuesday, Judge Gregory Adams imposes the sentence. 2 life sentences plus 20 years in prison. The numbers matter, but what they represent matters more. 2 life sentences is the court's way of saying this was not a single bad choice, it was a set of deliberate acts, abduction, sexual violence, armed threat, that altered a life forever. The additional 20 years is the system adding weight to the severity, stacking time onto time because the harm was stacked onto harm. There is a particular brutality in sexual violence cases that the law struggles to capture. Physical injury can heal. Evidence can be stored. Trials can happen. But the loss of safety is not something a sentence can fully restore. When the attacker forced the victim into the woods, he did not only commit a crime against her body, he committed a crime against her sense of the world. He turned an apartment door into a reminder. He turned a quiet evening into a warning. He forced her to learn, too early, that danger can arrive from behind you even when you are doing something as simple as locking up. The verdict and sentence do not erase that. What they can do, what they meant to do, is say publicly that the harm was real, that it mattered, that it is recognized as a crime, and that the person responsible is not beyond reach simply because he managed to stay unidentified for years. This case is also a story about systems, about what happens when a system is limited and what happens when it evolves. In 1988, investigators could take the report, collect the kit, search the woods, recover belongings, and still hit a wall because the science was not there. That is not an excuse, it is the reality of the era. The difference is what happened next. The evidence was not discarded, and decades later, the will to test old kits created a second chance. The cold case did not solve itself. It was solved because people decided that old evidence still deserved attention, because funding was secured, because laboratories did the meticulous work, because databases existed, because warrants were sought, because prosecutors built a case, because a survivor's report from 1988 was treated as something that still mattered. There is another hard truth underneath this timeline. An attacker who is not caught can live an entire lifetime while a survivor carries the consequences. For years, Colwell lived while the case sat a day. 4 years, the victim lived while the identity remained unknown. That asymmetry is what makes delayed justice feel complicated. Some people ask, what is the point after so long? The point is that accountability is not only about speed, it is about truth. It is about the message sent to survivors who reported and were not heard loudly enough. It is about the message sent to offenders who think time will protect them. And it is about preventing the quiet rewriting of history that happens when unsolved crimes are treated as unfortunate mysteries rather than unfinished obligations. When cold cases are solved through DNA, there is a temptation to treat them like magic tricks. The lab pulls a profile, the computer produces a name, and the story ends. But real cases are never that clean. They require preservation, paperwork, careful handling, competent testing, proper legal process. They require that someone, somewhere, did not give up. In this case, the preserved kit at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation becomes a kind of witness that cannot be intimidated. The victim's statement becomes a record that cannot be silenced. The recovered purse and scattered belongings become proof that this was not consensual, not imagined, not a misunderstanding. The database match becomes a bridge between 1988 and 2019. And the confirmatory DNA warrant becomes the final lock on the identification. The location matters too. Stone Mountain, the wooded area behind a residential complex, a place where everyday life presses right up against darkness. Crimes like this rely on the thinness of safety, on the moment a person is alone, on the blind spot between a door and a car, on the vulnerability of routine. The attacker used a mask to erase his face and a knife to erase resistance. He used the woods to erase witnesses. What he could not erase, even then, was the biological trace left behind, the piece of himself that ended up inside evidence he did not control. In 1988, he could not have fully understood what that trace could become. In 2019, it became the thing that reached back through time and named him. After sentencing, the public record becomes simple. A man from Albany, Georgia, now convicted in DeKalb County for a 1988 kidnapping, rape, and aggravated assault, sentenced to 2 life terms plus 20 years. But for the people who lived it, the record is not simple. For the survivor, the sentence is not an ending, it is a late recognition. It is the system speaking in a voice it should have used long ago. For investigators and prosecutors, it is both a success and a reminder of the backlog of other kits, other cases, other names still hidden. For the community, it is proof that almost 40 years ago does not mean too late. And for anyone watching from the outside, it is a warning. Time can delay justice, but it does not automatically cancel it, especially when evidence is preserved and when a society decides that the past is still accountable. If you zoom out, this story carries a bigger lesson that is uncomfortable but necessary. Progress in forensic science can reveal the scale of what was missed. Every solved cold case implies others that remain unsolved. Every tested kit implies others that sat untested for years. Every DNA match implies a person who walked free until the moment a database caught up with them. That does not mean the system is hopeless. It means the system has debt, and programs that fund testing are a way of paying it down case by case. The survivor in this story reported immediately. The kit was collected. The evidence was saved. The missing piece was the ability and the will to test it in time. When that ability arrived, the truth surfaced. And that is why this case hit so hard. It begins with a young woman at her own door, doing everything right, and still being attacked. It continues with her choosing to report, choosing to go through an exam, choosing to put her trauma into a file so that the system could act. It drags through decades where the name is unknown. Then it turns on a single modern breakthrough, testing old evidence and using national databases to identify an attacker. Finally, it ends in a courtroom with a judge announcing 2 life sentences and 20 years, a formal declaration that the masked man from 1988 was not a phantom, not a rumor, not an unsolved shadow. He was a real person, and the system finally spoke his name in public and held him responsible.